Okay. So remember, guys, we were talking about critical power and or critical velocity. This idea that there is this exercise intensity at which, as long as you stay under it, we can go indefinitely. If you get over it even a little bit, then you're going to go to VO2 max and you're going to experience fatigue. So whoever can go the fastest or do the most work at their critical power or their critical velocity or whatever you want to call it is likely going to be in a much more advantageous place to win some sort of an endurance race. Not the best, especially shorter distance ones where some strategy goes into the race and pacing strategy and kind of all of that sort of stuff. Um, but kind of very general things. So what I wanted to show you guys, these are some other kind of older data, and I think I may have actually shown a little bit of this previously. But these are data from David Poole at Kansas State. I think he did this while he was either a student or a postdoc in Carl Wasserman's lab in California. And so what they were basically trying to show in some ways, okay, is that basically that critical power and lactate threshold are not the same thing, okay? So this is lactate threshold, okay? Whatever this particular Roman or Greek symbol is, that's going to represent lactate threshold. And so it is basically, here's the wattage or the power output on the bike that occurs where lactate threshold occurs. Here's the absolute amount of oxygen consumption where it occurs. And then basically this kind of mu of VO2, it's the percentage of VO2 at which lactate threshold occurred. And then this WA these are going to be the parameters of the power relation, the kind of power relationship or the critical power. And so this is basically max power. This is what they're thinking of as critical power. And then W prime, we'll talk about W prime here in just a second. But this is some anaerobic work that can be done above critical power. And so this just illustrates, right, if you look at this, it's your actual oxygen consumption values. It's not quite double, but it's getting pretty close. The actual power output is quite a bit higher. So these are two very distinct concepts and very distinct parameters. And this is pre-training values. Here's some post-training values. And I want you guys to note basically that lactate threshold goes up, okay? And that it occurs at a little bit of higher percentage of your VO2 max. That critical power also went up, but it didn't go up quite, or the sort of percentage of VO2 max where it occurred was kind of about the same. And so there is some other evidence that you can make your critical power increase as a percentage of your VO2 max as you train. But then there's some kind of emerging stuff on how close your lactate threshold is to your critical power and the effect that that may have on, are you a better middle distance runner? Are you a better like marathon runner? Are you a better 10K runner? Something kind of somewhere in the midst of all that, which is a little bit beyond the scope of class. But I just want you guys to appreciate that both of these things, okay? So you can make your VO2 max go up. You can make your lactate threshold in an absolute sense go up. Your critical power go up in an absolute sense. You can certainly make your lactate threshold increase as a percentage of your VO2 max, and then you can probably make critical power go up as a percentage. So there we go in the midst of that. So one of the last things that I want to show you guys is an additional piece of this critical power concept. And mathematically, this is it's a thing that throws my head for loops in a lot of ways. Okay, so I just want you guys to try to stay with me, and then we can go back through it a couple of times. So the assumption, if you look at the critical power graph, so you've done multiple bouts of exercise that are above critical power, and we're going to fit this curve to it. Okay, so the idea is that if you take, in essence, right, you take the amount of work that can be performed above critical power, right, and the kind of time it takes you to fatigue at that particular work rate, you can calculate an area under the curve for each one of these little parameters, for each one of your bouts, okay? And so when your work that's being done above critical power is really, really high, then you may not be able to go very long. But you multiply the work above by the time, and you get some area. Then on this one, the work is not as high, but you again multiply your work rate by the time it takes you to reach fatigue. And what happens, so we call this work that can be performed over critical power, it's called W prime. But the crazy thing is we think it's a finite and fixed amount, okay? There is some amount, and each of these boxes that are drawn in here, if you calculate the area of all of these boxes, they're identical, okay? And so we think it has been characterized as an anaerobic work capacity that can be performed. But what it really is there is a set amount of work that can be energy, that you're going to get energy derived from substrate level phosphorylation, so the breakdown of individual ATP, PCR, right? Some levels of glycogen with a small aerobic contribution from myoglobin and venous hemoglobin O2 stores. And so this set amount of work may determine in some ways, say I'm running a race, right? And I'm going to run at my critical power until I get to the last minute, and then I can run at this pace, whatever this would be up here, for 1 minute before I basically conk out. Or I'm going to run and I'm going to kick, and I know that I can go at this particular pace for 2 minutes, right? And so once you have used up all of this fixed amount of work, you've got to slow back down and dip back under critical power. There's some really fascinating evidence that if you're like going to go run a 10K and you're running at critical power and you do that for 2 miles, and then you run above critical power for a minute and you use up some of this W prime, and then you slow back down and you get under critical power a little bit, that you can then reconstitute basically some of this W prime and have it again for later on in the race. And so there's some really fascinating implications for actual race strategy based upon sort of what your W prime is. And individual people, we have differing amounts of W prime. There is some thought that if we can increase your creatine phosphate stores in your muscles, we can make W prime actually increase. There is some data that if you take caffeine, that it may make your W prime go up a little bit as well. So there's kind of some fascinating things that are gonna go into all of that. Okay. Okay. So these are going to be some things now that are also that I took out of the MSSC review article for you. But when we know that you don't have to go very far above or below critical power to get this inexorable fatigue, what I'm going to show you here is these are data showing oxygen consumption levels and blood lactate levels during exercise performed like on the bike, okay, for 24 minutes when you're cycling basically at your critical power. And then they have people try to go 24 minutes at 5% above, right? And so you see they get up here and there's just, you're not going to reach steady state in VO2, and you're going to slowly climb up until you hit max and have to stop. And if you look at this, see here, we're getting this relative steady state at some point, and our blood lactate levels around 5 or thereabouts, 5 or 6. And then when you are above, it's going to kind of continue to climb. So remember that I told you guys, above critical power, VO2 will drift upwards and blood lactate will not reach a steady state. Okay. So this is from one paper that Andy Jones performed. The data on the right are actually things that were done, they're done in the magnet. So they're done in an MRI machine. And they're measuring creatine phosphate depletion here, and they're measuring change of intramuscular pH. And so this may have been hand grip exercise. And so they were doing like 2 additional watts of exercise, but they're at critical power. You get a little bit of creatine phosphate depletion early on, and then it reaches a steady state, like 2 watts above critical power when you're doing hand grip. And then you're going to get this steady, inexorable decline in creatine phosphate, right? So we're doing all of this anaerobic work. And then you can also see pH, where the pH is gonna fall in these kinds of ways. And so the inverse of the pH graph is there's a steady increase in inorganic phosphate inside the muscles. So you're going to become more and more acidic because of this increase in blood lactate that we're ever seen. And so pH is stable at critical power, and it falls inexorably above. And you'll see here they don't go nearly as long when they do all of this. So what we know is that when you get above critical power, you are using up your anaerobic stores, you're making additional lactate, there is going to be acidity that accumulates in the intramuscular environment. There's no steady states that are going to be reached, and that's the thing that predicts fatigue. It's really this decline in pH and the rise in inorganic phosphate that are going to accompany the increase in blood lactate and the depletion of creatine phosphate that are going to cause this drift in VO2 max, and they're going to cause the fatigue. Okay. So these are, hopefully I have convinced you in some ways that critical power is a real thing, right? And there are some physiological things that are going on. And so one of the things that is kind of fascinating is what are the measured parameters? Like, so what's the physiology that actually determines critical power? So the data here on the left are going to show in the open circles. These are data when people were given hyperoxic gas. So they were given like 26 or 27% O2 gas to breathe. And then the dark circles is the control condition where they're getting the normal 21% gas. And so you can see that when I give you hyperoxic gas, I can make critical power go up a little bit. Okay. On the right, this is from hand gripping exercise. And they did forearm occlusion. So they put a blood pressure cuff on over the person's bicep. They inflated it. And they cut off blood flow entirely to the working muscles. And so you will note that basically critical power is less than 0, which is an odd statistical phenomenon. Don't think about it too much or your brain will explode. But basically, when you cut off oxygen, there's this dramatic reduction. And so together, these things provide us significant amounts of evidence that critical power is a parameter of aerobic metabolic function. Okay? Work above critical power may be an anaerobic thing and have some things that can be influenced by creatine phosphate levels and buffering capacity and things like that. But critical power is maybe a little bit influenced by buffering, but it really is a component of aerobic metabolic function. Okay, so of those things, mitochondria, capillaries, cardiac output, okay, a lot of the things that contribute to VO2 max, we think contribute to critical power. Okay, so what we have here, these are some data from my buddy Carl Otte at Kansas State that they did as part of a project for NASA. And what I'm showing you here is R-squared values or R values showing a correlation basically between this 10-kilometer walk back time. So it's 10 kilometers walking, carrying like some heavy loads and things. Megan, this may be of some. This was done to kind of approximate astronauts trying to perform tasks and do things on the moon, or more specifically maybe on Mars. And they measured their critical running speed, okay, here. So this is critical velocity, and they've got that corresponding to this 10-kilometer walk back time, R value of 0.8. This is the speed, their running speed at VO2 max, okay. R value is close, but a little bit less. This is their actual VO2 max, a little bit lower still, okay. And then this is their gas exchange threshold, which was their approximation of lactate threshold. The women weren't significant, and the men were at about 0.6 as well. So of these things, here's an actual task that might approximate people doing something in the real world that would be a measure of and require aerobic metabolism and work capacity, and critical speed or critical running velocity was a better predictor than some of our other more traditional measures of performance. Similarly, they had another kind of task where they had them not just do a walk back, but they kind of created an obstacle course type of thing. And you had to carry a load and go up and down like over these obstacles and crawl through things. And it was meant to It was meant to try to approximate some of the kinds of tasks that might need to be performed if you were on the surface of Mars, or you were Matt Damon stuck in The Martian or something like that. And again, what I want you all to appreciate is that they found that critical running velocity was a better predictor of performance on this physical abilities task than some of their other things. Although the speed at VO2 max was actually pretty good, but some of the other kind of more traditional ways of measuring things were not quite as predictive. Okay. All right. So going to stop sharing, and it occurred to me that I think I posted the wrong year's version of those slides for you guys in Canvas. I actually have a slightly more up-to-date version of those. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna open up those and no, wait, where did it go? And see if there was anything else that I thought was really, really important on there to try to share with you guys. No. Hypoxia. Nope. Cycle. Nope. So there's some more things that people have done, kind of looking at hypoxia and those kinds of things. We did an occlusion study. Other people have gone to altitude and looked at critical power at altitude, and it all looks exactly what you would think. If you limit oxygen to the muscles, then critical power goes down. There's some interesting stuff from Tom Barstow's lab, also at Kansas State. You guys may be seeing a theme in the midst of all of this, and then some stuff that we confirmed with one of our electrical stimulation tests, that if you play with the duty cycle of intermittent contractions, so if you do something where it's like doing a hand grip task, so you squeeze for 2 seconds, relax for 2 seconds, squeeze for 2 seconds, relax for 2 seconds. If you make the squeeze longer, so I'm going to squeeze for 4 seconds and then relax for 2 seconds. When you do things like that during those contractions, you actually occlude blood flow into the working muscles. And so when you ramp up the duty cycle in that particular way, you actually you can lower critical power, which has some interesting ideas. It doesn't become much of a deal for like running, but it might have some cycling kind of implications. So there we go. Okay. You guys want to do what is the word that I'm looking for? Do you want to do critical thinking questions? Yay, use my words. Or we just want to have everybody show us your pets. Alex has his dog. Megan, is your cat there?
So we actually have 3 cats, and they're all in different rooms sleeping right now.
Okay. Tuesday? Was it Tuesday morning? Tuesday in the morning, we did Brian Pribble's oral comprehensive exams, and Brian took the exam with his little dachshund like sitting in his lap for like the first hour and a half of the test. It was pretty fabulous. And I was like, that's just what everybody needs to do, right? Like we just need to, just everybody have your comfort animal with you while you're doing stressful things like this. That would be super fabulous, I think. So, okay. So let's really kind of dive in on all of this. So Keldon, you like to train people, do things, might want to do some of that as a career. Give me a parameter that you think is going to contribute to endurance exercise performance, that it might be important to measure in people.
Lactate threshold.
Lactate threshold. Okay. So Keldon says lactate threshold. Alex, do you agree that that's maybe an important thing?
Yes.
Okay. Did you write anything on how might a person train their lactate threshold?
Is that to me or Alex?
We're going to start with Alex, Kelvin, and we're going to come back to you. Don't worry.
Let me see. I did not sort of towards. I mentioned lactate threshold in some of the things that should be considered when training for endurance, and just kind of threw it into the same parameter as VO2 max or some of the physiological adaptations that could occur, and kind of tied it back to some of the things we talked about before to track overall work. And there's also ways to specifically train VO2, which I'm not super familiar with, so I didn't put too much into that because I'm not familiar with training methodologies, but I just kind of tied back to the whole topic of just kind of overloading the amount of work we do over the course of a time, and through that we should theoretically experience adaptations for increasing lactate threshold and also increasing VO2 max.
Okay.
So just, yeah.
No, that's fine. So Keldon, you want to take a crack at lactate threshold specifically? You want to try to help Alex out a little bit?
Sure. I put kind of training above and below the threshold, being able to increase the clearance rate. Basically just being able to cause the adaptations, kind of like, I think it was this last Sam with MCT proteins, and then increasing mitochondrial density in order to help with that as well.
Okay, good. So, and I know we mentioned in the aerobic training section that, right, you can or you will increase lactate threshold with kind of the same kind of training that should make your VO2 max go up, has a chance to make your lactate threshold go up. But one of the things that we do know is that if you really want to specifically try to work on lactate threshold, maybe even in the absence of VO2, although it's kind of hard to extricate those two things, is you've got to work out over lactate threshold, sort of period, end of discussion, full stop. As Kelvin says, to work on training your ability to clear. The things that you do that make VO2 max go up, like more capillaries, bigger cardiac output, more mitochondria, will certainly help on the production side, right? Because you can run more aerobic metabolism. But then some of the other things you got to be over so that you can kind of work on getting adaptations that are going to also help you from the clearance standpoint. You like that kind of double whammy of those two particular things. So it sucks, right? But you need to do those things, kind of shorter bouts, higher intensity kinds of, that kind of training is going to be really, really important. So if you make them run, we used to call them like suicides, but I don't know, or like run sidelines or something. When I played basketball in junior high, and for a little while in high school, we had to start on the baseline and sprint and touch the one foul line and then sprint back and then sprint to half court and back and those things. But things like that where you're doing 30 seconds or something of exercise. Megan, you mentioned the bleep test the other day in your thing that people used to run the bleep test. If nobody knows what the bleep test is, just YouTube it. It's very popular in soccer and things, but it freaking sucks. But things like that where you're going at kind of a pretty high intensity. So, okay. Good. Jacob, give us another parameter of something that you think contributes.
Yeah. I also was talking about critical power with it, and I don't know if it ties into the lactate threshold, because near the end we kind of start tying in together. But I thought that was an important part for endurance performance, because if you're able to increase your critical power, you're able to run at intensities that would not lead to a super increase in lactate to where it would cause fatigue. very rapidly. And so by knowing A, the value, and also B, being able to train it to work a little higher, you'd be able to, like I said, run longer without having that massive increase in lactate, drop in pH, or increase in pH, and increase in inorganic phosphate.
Okay. Okay. Megan, do you agree? You're not on mute, Megan, but I can't hear you. Nope, still can't hear you. Okay, well, Megan's gone. Ryan, do you want to pinch hit?
On if I agree or not.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think that whenever you train above or below your critical power, that it affects your lactate threshold. And is that? I'm sorry, I got distracted by Megan not being
No,
able
that's
to talk.
okay. That's okay. So the really, and I'm not that aware of too much stuff with all of this. The really interesting thing is, what if I want to move both, right? What if I want to move lactate threshold and I want to move critical power? I want to try to get my lactate threshold as close to my critical power as possible, but I wanted to move both of them as close to VO2 max as I possibly can. Is there, right, like, is there some magic? Like, do I need to train? Because, right, if you try to train over critical power, you can't train very well, right? Like, it's hard to do that. But maybe that's actually, would it be better to do high intensity interval training than kind of longer, slower distance training to look at trying to work those things? We know that doing intervals is good for lactate threshold. I need to look. I don't know why I haven't. Let me, while we're doing this, I'm gonna get on PubMed and actually look for something to see. If you told me that doing interval training was better at moving, we know that you get a reasonably similar increase in VO2 max, but if you told me that was better at training critical power than traditional training was, I would probably believe that. But I don't know, because there is some thought that the intervals don't increase capillary density as much. So
Can you guys hear me now?
yes, we can hear you now, Megan. What happened?
I got a phone call that obviously I ignored, but I think my computer was like confused and I don't know, just decided that I couldn't use my microphone anymore.
But why were you getting a phone call on your computer?
Because my Mac's connected to my phone, and so it pops up. It's really annoying when I'm on Zoom. It pops up and starts ringing over your voices and all that.
Interesting. Okay, well, let me look at this. I found the combined effects of sprint interval training and post-exercise blood flow restriction on critical power, capillary growth, haha, and mitochondrial proteins in trained cyclists. Where are these people from? From Loughborough University in the United Kingdom. Okay, let me get down here. Let me read the abstract. New and noteworthy, 4 weeks increased critical power. Post-exercise blood flow restriction did not enhance that any further. I don't really know why they would have thought it would have. No changes in capillary or mitochondrial protein content. So, interesting. So they got no increase in VO2 max, but they made the critical power go up. I'm very baffled by this. So I'm gonna have to, Ron, we're gonna have to read this one. We're gonna have to dig in on this one and figure out what's happening. So, okay. Who else? Who's got something? Pearson, Callie, you got something?
I mentioned running economy.
Okay. Very key. Very key. Pearson, did you also mention running economy, or did you got something else? Oh, now we can't hear Pearson.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we got you.
Okay, I think my internet's just lagging a little bit. Everything I put's kind of been mentioned, but
Okay.
no one completely mentioned VO2 max, I guess. So I mentioned that and
Okay.
increasing mitochondria numbers and capillary density.
Okay. No, increasing VO2 max is really, really important. It absolutely is. The problem is that some of us or some of you are, maybe genetically limited in what I mean, we all are in theory genetically limited on how high we can make our VO2 max go up. But it is very, very, I mean, I can run all I want. Most of you can probably run all you want, and you're never going to be like an elite, like collegiate distance runner, no matter, we can all train perfectly. That's probably not going to happen. So I don't know. Okay. So Callie, let's talk about your movement economy.
Like training? Is that
Yeah, like not your economy specifically, but like in general, how would we train movement economy?
I talked about first of all weightlifting, because I remember taking principles of endurance training with Aaron,
Mhm.
and he talked about the importance of like actually doing strength training because every time you step and when you run, you like generate force, and so you're able to engage those muscles more.
Yep.
And then I also talked about form, because like personally, as a runner, when you use the wrong form, it just makes it horrible. And then when you use the right form, it's so much better because it's more efficient.
Okay. Okay. I would tend to agree with you. Maybe why I hate running is because I just have really bad running form. I don't know. Maybe that's my problem. That my dad, the marathon runner, didn't teach me how to run correctly or something. I don't know. Although to be honest, Callie, those of you that are a little taller and have sort of longer legs per your height, it is a little easier for you guys to do those things than those of us that are not blessed in that particular way. Okay, so resistance training, good. It still kills me. Kelvin, does it make you chuckle that like Aaron's teaching the endurance training class? The weight training guy is teaching the endurance training class. Why wasn't he teaching the advanced strength and conditioning class in that particular way? But we'll live to fight another day. I mean, he does a really good job, or did a really good job with it. That was always one of those things that I would just kind of chuckle in there. So okay. Anybody have anything else?
I talked a little bit about fatigue.
Okay, let's talk about fatigue, Alex. What did you say about fatigue?
I kind of tied it into critical power because when I looked a little bit more into it, it seemed like especially peripheral fatigue was something that came up in combination with critical power a lot. So I think just really through driving adaptations and almost all the things that we've already mentioned, like VO2 max, lactate threshold, I think we can, I guess, increase the threshold for peripheral fatigue and then also for muscular function and some of the things like mitochondria function that we talked about. I mean, all of these things are going to contribute to being better at not fatiguing peripherally as fast. And then I also mentioned central fatigue, but I didn't really know how I could incorporate anything in terms of training there. So I just mentioned it and just kind of left it at that. I would have no idea of how to even approach any adaptations, or I don't even know if you could make the claim for adaptations for central fatigue.
Okay. One of the things that we do know at least a little bit about some levels of central fatigue, and this is partially why. So, you guys remember when I told you all? I think that sometimes distance runners train too much. I remember me kind of getting crossways about all of that. That like, right, if your race is 5,000 meters, why are you running 10 miles and those kinds of things? Why are you running for such a long time when all that extra stuff isn't going to further improve your VO2 max? And we talked about that maybe you need to be doing intervals and these kinds of things to make lactate threshold go up and to maybe have a better chance to make critical power go up and those things. So here's where central fatigue may play some role in the midst of all of this, okay? think about longer endurance activities, and even shorter ones where you're going to go at a pretty high level. Anybody run a half marathon? No, I think, okay, well, so we did this. All right. So having been that distance or walked an entire marathon, some of that is not about physiologically can you do it. I could take all of you and you could probably all go run a half marathon today. Like if I was chasing you with a cattle prod or something. Like I'm in a golf cart behind you, with a cattle prod. You could probably do it. As long as you went slow enough, you could probably manage to make it that far. You feel terrible tomorrow, but you could do it. And so one of the interesting things is that physiologically you can do things, but from a motivational standpoint and kind of a perception of effort and dealing with kind of the mental challenge of going for that amount of time and being uncomfortable for that long if you're pushing those things, is there does seem to be some evidence that practicing that, right, knowing what to expect, being more familiar with that does actually help for when you're going to go do a race. And that's why, even though going and running for 2 hours or running 20 miles as you prep for the marathon, I mean, it's not making your VO2 max go up to go run 20 miles any more so than it is if you ran like 5 or 6, right? But part of what you're doing is you're mentally training for, man, that's a long time. That's such a long time. Man, it sucks to go that far, right? So that you are aware and understand kind of what's happening, and that may maintain motivation and let you tolerate pain and discomfort and things for a longer period of time. So, my things are, if you want to run a half marathon, then you better train up to pretty close to that half marathon distance if you want to do as well as you can. If you want to run a marathon, you probably need to train, right? And that's not a physiology thing, right? Like you could train by running 5 or 6 miles at a time, tops probably, and get your VO2 max to about the same place. And so physiologically, you're in the same place as you were, but if you've never run that distance, your ability to actually perform well over that distance is probably going to be a little bit lessened in a lot of people. So my anger sometimes is with the people that run a 5K and then go run like 12 miles and their race is a 5K. They need to train hard. They need to train running at that 5K pace. They need to train running over that 5K pace in some way so that they can get sort of the more specific adaptations and the mental kind of challenge and adaptation to all of that. So anyway, so you're barking up the right tree there, Alex, with the central fatigue stuff. Okay. Anything else? All right.
Can you tell me if I have like the right idea for this?
Sure.
So like with capillary density, with the lower the capillary density, the lower the VO2 max, because that also lowers your lactate threshold.
Potentially.
Right. And then so a higher capillary density means that there will be a longer time for fatigue. So then it would lead to a higher performance rate because you're not going to fatigue as quickly.
That's correct.
Okay, cool.
Remember.
That was my question.
We have that? Yeah. I'm sharing the screen again. Remember this one here? Max VO2, capillary per fiber ratio. There's this nice kind of linear relationship. And so the idea behind that, is, and this is one of the reasons why people that have big muscles, in addition to having to carry those muscles around, when you do resistance training, we didn't talk about this very much, but when you do resistance training, your capillary to fiber ratio can, if you are not concurrently endurance training, can fall and fall pretty dramatically, right? And when that happens, now your VO2 max is going to go down. Your lactate threshold is going to fall because you've got more muscle that's capable of using energy and those things to generate force, maybe to propel yourself forward because you weigh more in those things, but you have less ability to actually get oxygen to them. And so in that way, resistance training can very much be, or hypertrophy, I should say, can potentially be very detrimental to aerobic capacity. And so, again, we don't talk about it in this class, but there's a huge amount of research out there on doing concurrent training, people that are doing both resistance training and aerobic training simultaneously. And is there interference of those two things? Is one limiting the other? And the answer is probably yes, a little bit, but probably not enough that if you are going to do something where it's going to be important to have as big and strong as you can be, but also to have as much kind of aerobic capacity, that it's probably, you're at like 95% on each of what you could have been by doing well alone. So it's probably worth doing both. So, but yes, Ryan, I'm sorry. That's a long answer to just say yes, you're right. You're conceptualizing it correctly. Okay. Jacob, you've now made me feel like that I need to I need to give some sort of like, oh, captain, my captain speech to all of you guys at the end here on everything, since you said that's what Dr. Markham did today. Like stand up on my chair and applaud you guys for everything. But that's it. That's all we got for the semester.